Hello and welcome to this edition of Fulton Justice. I'm your host, Yolanda Lewis, District Court Administrator for the Atlanta Judicial Circuit. This program is dedicated to providing you with resources, information, and a closer look at how our justice system works for you. February is National Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. While this is a subject that many choose to ignore or pay less attention to, it cannot simply be swept under the rug. There are staggering statistics to suggest that teens are experiencing dating violence at an astonishing rate. According to recent studies, 1 in 3 teenagers report knowing a friend or a peer who has experienced physical harm by their partner. More than 1 in 4 teenage girls in a relationship report enduring repeated verbal abuse. Today, we'll tackle this issue head on with Daphne Walker, President and CEO of the Partnership Against Domestic Violence. The mission of PADV is to end the crime of intimate partner violence and empower its survivors. Join us next as we have a candid conversation with Daphne Walker on her expertise and work to empower teens and victims across the state of Georgia. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Fulton Justice. Joining us now is Daphne Walker, President and CEO of the Partnership Against Domestic Violence. Welcome, Judge Walker.
Well, thank you.
And I say judge because you have a long history. I should say also welcome back to Fulton County. Tell us a little bit about where you started out with Fulton County.
Well, I started out actually in the Crimes Against Women and Children Unit in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. And that was actually where my commitment to domestic violence was born. Paul Howard assigned me to that unit. I had the opportunity to not only deal with domestic violence cases, but also teen prostitution cases at that time. And then started to see that that was an area that I was really interested in and committed to. And when I left the district attorney's office, I went into private practice and had an opportunity on the civil side to work with survivors of domestic violence, representing them in child custody cases, legitimation actions, and the like. And then I had the opportunity to run for office in 2004 and became a judge and also heard temporary protective orders. So throughout my 15-year legal career, I've always been involved in some way with the issue of domestic violence.
So now you're with the Partnership for Domestic Violence. Tell us a little bit about your organization and what led you to make this decision from the bench to working as an advocate for victims now.
Well, last September, I was actually contacted because of my work in the area of domestic violence when they were looking for a new president and CEO for the Partnership Against Domestic Violence. And at that time, I was also thinking about transitioning from the bench into an area where I truly felt like I could commit my time and energy more effectively on the issue of domestic violence. I was teaching different people throughout the country on the issue and also here in the state of Georgia, and decided it would be a good opportunity for me to commit to it full time. And so what I did at that particular point was to interview just like anyone else and was able to become the next president and CEO of the Partnership Against Domestic Violence. We are the largest domestic violence agency in the state of Georgia. And we also operate the largest domestic violence shelter in the state of Georgia, a 55-bed facility that we have in Gwinnett County. We also operate another large domestic violence shelter here in Fulton County, which is a 41-bed facility. And so that's primarily, I would say, about 50% of what we do is shelter operations. The other part of what we do is outreach and prevention, because we recognize that although we want to provide emergency shelter to victims of domestic violence, we also want to put them in a position of being self-sufficient. So we have a supportive housing program where we assist them with transitioning back into the community. We also have our outreach programs, which focuses on teen dating violence, as well as our legal advocacy program. And we have advocates that are right here in Fulton County inside the courthouse as part of the Safe Communities Initiative to provide legal advocacy support to survivors of domestic violence. And then we also have our teen dating violence program and a 24-hour crisis line to provide prevention and outreach services to those that don't want to come into shelter. And that's really important because we actually serve about 560 people in shelter per year, but we serve about 5,000 people outside of the shelters. And so our outreach program is very significant. And then our teen dating violence program that we launched, basically because we looked at the fact that in Georgia, teen dating violence, we're actually the #1 state in the country for our rate of teen dating violence. And so what we decided is it was really important to also go into the schools and start to talk with middle schoolers and high schoolers about the issue of teen dating violence. And so we do have a very active program there, as well as our annual Teen Summit to address that issue with teens.
Now, speaking of teen violence, this month is a special month for that cause. Can you tell us a little bit about how significant this month is?
This, of course, is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. What the federal government did in 2006 was to recognize the importance of differentiating between teen dating violence and domestic violence among women and their partners. And what we recognize is that there are very significant differences that need to be addressed differently, because a lot of teenagers get their advice, if you will, about how to develop their relationships from pop culture and videos and those types of things. So the way that we target that audience and educating them on healthy relationships is a lot different than the way we target an adult audience. And so finally in 2010, the federal government recognized it as Teen Dating Violence Prevention and Awareness Month. And so this month, what we had the opportunity to do at Primerica, they hosted us over in Duluth, was to provide a teen dating violence summit. We had 400 kids that actually came to the summit physically. Glenda Hatchett, who was a former judge here in Fulton County, was our keynote speaker. But we also recognized that we have to be open to teenagers on their level. So what we also did was have a simulcast. And so we also had teens join us throughout the state of Georgia who were able to log on to our website and join the Teen Summit virtually as opposed to being in person. And we talked about what healthy relationships look like. The fact that just because he's texting you or she's texting you all the time, that doesn't mean that that person cares about you. It could mean that they're engaging in an unhealthy relationship with you. So we really have tried to focus our energy on talking to teens on their level, if you will, with their technology, because we are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, making sure that we're getting the message out to teens about the importance of healthy relationships.
Very good cause. Let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk about the teens and the work you're doing there, but I want to talk about parents. So often parents have, they're not aware of what signs to look for if their child is being abused, because, of course, there could be multiple signs, isolation from their parents and things of that nature. Tell us what parents should look for in the instance that they think their teens are being abused.
The most obvious thing is a change in your child. And we tell people a lot of times, the child you have. Your child was generally quiet, and now they're, always boisterous, having outbursts. That change in personality is usually a sign. If they're not engaged in their schoolwork the way that they've previously been, if they were an A+ student and now they're getting C's and D's, that also can be indicative of that. But also looking at behavioral changes. If they are constantly answering their telephone or constantly texting, because they feel like a person is looking for them or a person has to know where they are all the time. Those are signs to look for. And what we want parents to do is to make sure that they're paying attention to those signs, because statistically about 68% of parents don't have any idea that their children have been involved in a teen dating violence relationship, but they learn of it later. And then they say, oh, wait a minute. I do remember when my child started to change in this area and that area. So we tell parents to be encouraged by your instincts. So if you kind of sense that something is different or something is wrong, it probably is. And taking the time to explore that conversation with your child in a non-judgmental way.
So are there differences between the number of male and female teens that are experiencing abuse?
No, we actually see it on both sides, where males are equally abused by females, and so as females are by males, and so that we tell people not to really focus on that, but also to recognize that it can happen to either gender. We also want people to recognize it can happen same gender, and a lot of times that situation is ignored because people oftentimes don't recognize it can also be a same gender situation where a person is being stalked or harassed or intimidated in some way. And so we always say it doesn't impact any particular race, socioeconomic background, or gender. It can impact and affect anyone who's a teenager.
So I know, we have a very active domestic violence court here in Fulton County, but is there any correlation between adult domestic violence and the type of violence that teens experience in their relationships?
Yes, what we recognize is that if a teen is exposed to domestic violence in their home environment, there's a likelihood that they will also either end up being an abuser or being subject to some type of abuse when they develop their later relationships. And that's why we think it is critically important at the Partnership Against Domestic Violence to start at that middle school and teenage level to start talking with them about healthy relationships. Because even if they're seeing an unhealthy relationship at home, hopefully by our intervention and our prevention methods, they will recognize that even though that's an unhealthy relationship I see at home, I know what's necessary for me to have a healthy relationship.
And you're talking about in elementary school, and I know most parents would say, what are you going to say to my child in elementary school to talk to them about this issue? So what do you tell the children in elementary school?
Well, we have a full curriculum. It is a 6-week curriculum that we use in our middle and high schools, and we do have to tell them in a way that's age appropriate, and I think that's really important, and also that's very non-judgmental, because what we recognize is that kids at that age are very impressionable, and if you suggest to them that they're doing something wrong or they haven't responded appropriately in a certain situation, that could discourage them from revealing abuse. And so we always try to make sure that we're talking in an age-appropriate manner. At our Teen Summit, all of our presenters were teenagers for the most part, except Judge Hatchett, because we wanted to make sure that the conversation was a peer-on-peer conversation. And we also educate teens on what they should tell to their peers, because a lot of times what we see is teens and middle schoolers telling their friends but not telling their parents. And so we also focus a lot on that peer mentoring. If a friend comes to you and says that this has happened to them, what they should do in that situation.
So people want to help. Certainly whenever you see a teen that is experiencing a traumatic situation like this, you want to help. Two-part question: what should you do to help, and then what shouldn't you do in instances that may harm the child more or the teen more?
The biggest thing people can do is listen. And I know that sounds very basic, but a lot of times it takes people a significant amount of courage to admit that they're in an abusive relationship. And if the first response they get is something judgmental, or you're better than that, or you shouldn't be involved in that, a lot of times it shuts that teenager down. And so what we tell people first and foremost is listen. Just give that person the opportunity to share their story, and also recognize that even though they're sharing it with you at that time does not mean that they're ready to leave an abusive relationship or that they're ready to report the abuse. And so even if they're not ready to do that at that point, don't try to force them into doing it. Just recognize that you still want to be a sounding board for them. If you believe that person is truly in jeopardy, we would, of course, recommend calling us, because a lot of times people think that you only call a hotline for shelter services, but our crisis line is available also to help with safety planning. So if the person's not ready to leave, we can also help them with what kind of safety measures they need to take until they decide it's appropriate to leave, but also what resources are available. And so, of course, I would encourage them to contact our crisis line, which is 404-873-1766, or they could go to our website, which is www.padv.org. And it also gives some initial information on what that person might need to do if they're not ready to leave. And then once that person decides to leave, then the best thing you can do is help them to escape it. And even there are times that people who are assisting with the escape may also need assistance, and they could also go to our website and contact the crisis line as well.
So I want to talk about the different types of abuse, because I think sometimes when you hear the word violence, you automatically assume that if a person is in an abusive relationship, that it's a slap, a punch, a kick. Talk about the different types of abuse that can occur in relationships.
Well, abuse can oftentimes be physical. That's the most common one that people think about. But actually, the majority of people suffer most emotional abuse. And so we always tell people it can be physical, emotional, verbal, or sexual. One of those four categories. And what we see, as I said, the most is emotional and verbal abuse. And I also tell people that it's usually the longest lasting form of abuse, because if you have ever fallen and skinned your knee, later when it heals, unless somebody points that out to you, sometimes you forget about it. So the physical abuse, oftentimes people can forget about. But what we recognize is the emotional and verbal abuse usually stays with people. And that's the most prevalent. And so what we want to remind people is, yes, the physical abuse is bad, but verbal, emotional, and sexual abuse is equally as bad in a relationship, and also can have some more lasting effects when it comes to that person not being able to function, not having healthy relationships, and also later either becoming a victim of domestic violence or an abuser.
Now, we've talked about the services that you offer to victims, but there is another side to this, and certainly we know that sometimes, especially if you're young, you may have seen the abuse in your home or with family members or others around you. Talk about how important it is to address that aspect of the abuser as well, those tendencies.
One of the things that I can tell you from being in courts, actually, is that if in fact we don't get to the abuser, we never get to resolving the issue of domestic violence. And a lot of times people who are in victim advocacy organizations like mine don't always want to particularly address that. But one of the things that we've looked at is we've also got to be able to educate men and educate young boys who are primarily abusers, although they can be women. We need to primarily educate them on the importance of not engaging that relationship. And so a lot of our prevention and outreach also will begin to be targeted towards that. We actually are in partnership with an organization now to look at a call to men, where we're actually going to focus on what can we tell men and how can we engage them on the issue of domestic violence and preventing it. Through the court system, they also have family violence intervention programs. To be frank with you, the statistics are not the best when it comes to whether they actually complete those programs. But what we do know is the individuals that do complete family violence intervention programs have indicated, you know what, this has changed my perspective on what's appropriate in a relationship and what's not. And so that's an area that we would still want to encourage courts to make sure that defendants are being sentenced to family violence intervention programs, with the hopes that that would at least be an outreach effort for them. Because a lot of times once they go through the criminal justice system, there is not a lot of outreach after that outside of a family violence intervention program. So we would definitely encourage that participation.
And so do you think those types of programs apply to teens? Because I think you're dealing with a whole new set of issues, the youthfulness of the person who is now considered an abuser. So would those same principles apply?
The same principles would apply. I think also when you're working with that population, though, your focus would also be, what can we do to help to shape what their belief system is, because a lot of them are still in that process of really developing what they believe in and what they don't believe in when it comes to abuse and the way that you treat people in relationships. And so that gives us an opportunity to really look at that young person and say, what can we do to kind of shape what they believe with regards to healthy relationships? And so I do think it's important to not only implement our curriculum, but also to have others being willing to go into schools and to talk with young people about healthy relationships and what's appropriate.
I want to talk a little bit about the schools. I know that we talk about what parents should do. We talk about the work that your organization is doing. We talk about what a teen should do if they are in that situation or if they witness that situation. What should educators do to take an active role in protecting teens who may be experiencing violence?
Well, what we see oftentimes is that someone who's been exposed to intimate partner violence in their home, sometimes they may not show aggression against somebody in a teen dating violence relationship, but they actually show their aggression by way of bullying. And so a lot of times we have educators that don't address the issue of bullying in the school environment, and that's an area that we would like for them to address, because what we do know is a lot of times if kids end up being bullies in the school environment, they also later have the likelihood of becoming batterers in relationships. And so what we would hope is educators will intervene at that level and make sure that they stand up for people that are being bullied and give people and students in their schools the space to come in and report that behavior and make sure that it's corrected.
And so there's no specific face of violence and there's no specific face of abuse. Tell us what are the most common myths about violence, domestic violence, and teen violence that you've experienced?
I say the biggest myth is people saying that it can't happen to me. One of the things that we enjoy is one of our board members actually is a woman who is in a professional environment, had a great income, great employment opportunity, 2 children, the dog, everything that you would expect in a typical family relationship, but she was going through abuse. And so what I think one of the biggest myths is this can't happen to me because I'm not in a low socioeconomic background, which is a myth. People believe that only the people who are in low socioeconomic backgrounds suffer abuse. One of the things that I recall when I first started my job is pulling up to our Gwinnett shelter, and on one side I saw a Honda Accord, on the right side I saw a Jaguar. And so it gives you a real indication that it doesn't affect one socioeconomic group or another. Everybody needs our shelter services. So I think that's one of the biggest myths, that it can't affect me because I'm not from a low socioeconomic background, or I'm not a particular race because it is not based upon race, or I'm not a particular gender because we also have men that call us for shelter services. Now we don't house them in shelter, we assist them with finding a location to stay. Because our shelters are strictly for women and children. But we do assist them if they call us for help. And a lot of times people say it can't happen to men, but we also want that myth to be dispelled, because men can also be victims of abuse as well.
Now, I know we've talked about how significant this month is and how important it is for us to look for these signs. Tell me a little bit about what do you think is the most important aspects of prevention that we need to look at for Georgia right now?
The most important aspect is recognizing, one, that we're number one in the country for teen dating violence, and that if we don't intervene, that same population of young people had the potential of being batterers or victims and survivors of domestic violence as well. And so the most important thing I think right now is intervention, and recognizing that we can't be afraid to have the conversation. A lot of times, especially in our communities, people don't want to talk about it. They think it's a family issue. And we shouldn't get involved. If a husband and wife are having a disagreement, or if a boyfriend and girlfriend are having a disagreement, why should we get involved? Well, the reason we want to get involved is because we have to recognize that domestic violence doesn't just impact that couple. If that child is exposed to it and they come to school and they bully your child, now your child has become a victim. If the abuser decides to go to work, to the workplace of the alleged victim, and engage in some kind of rampage where he's shooting people or stabbing people or attempting to commit some type of harm against that victim, everyone who's in that workplace is now subject to some type of harm or the potential for it. And so that's one of the most important things I think we have to look at, that it's an important issue because it can impact all of us. It's not a private issue that only involves that couple or the people in that relationship.
Absolutely. So give us some final thoughts about teen violence, and also the resources that you believe that you have available at your organization to help people.
Well, I would say my final thoughts on it are that we have to be willing to be proactive, and so our goal is to prevent it before it starts. And so we are now actively going into middle schools and high schools to make sure that we're educating teens on the issues of healthy relationships. And also putting them in contact with certain resources. I mentioned our website earlier. That's probably the quickest way for them to find it at www.padv.org, which also has links to other resources that are specific to sexual abuse or physical abuse or those types of things. We also have resources there for parents. So if you're not clear on how to have that conversation with your children, we guide you through that process. And then I will finally say is not being afraid to speak up. If in fact you see something happening with a young person, being willing to intervene and have that conversation that they may not be able to have with their parents is important, because they may trust you in a way that they don't trust their parents. And being able to intervene and assist in their behalf is something that would definitely benefit that teen in the long run.
Thank you so much for all of the information. You're doing great work, and we appreciate it. Up next, we'll have our closing thoughts. Stay tuned. As we acknowledge National Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, we welcome Daphne Walker, President and CEO of the Partnership Against Domestic Violence. Today we shared information that all parents, guardians, and adults with teens in their lives should know. There are resources available to help the cycle of abuse and violence and empower survivors. Each of us can play a role in ending teen dating violence, not just in February, but every day of the month and every day of the year. I hope that you'll commit to helping protect our children as one of our most valuable resources. Thank you for joining us today on Fulton Justice. I'll see you next time.